Hello, my name is Sue Bay, and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and a professor of clinical psychology. Today, I will be talking with Dr. Cynthia Lubin Langtiw. I am so excited to have this conversation with her.
What has it been like for you to be a psychologist of color in various roles, such as clinician, professor, supervisor, researcher, consultant, in the context of racism, equity, and social responsibility over the years? What has changed since you first began your career?
Um, those are great questions. I'll start with the last part of it. What has changed since I first began?
Sure.
So when I first began my career, I think back to grad school. And in my graduate program, initially, we didn't even have a required diversity course, right? And now I can't imagine, like as a professor of psychology, somebody who supervises and does this work, I can't imagine not having a diversity course at all, not having a space for self-reflection, not having a space for understanding the power dynamics that not might, but do occur between myself and my clients in the community, as well as who I am as a human being and as a supervisor. So I think that the focus on diversity and the focus on the importance of understanding what we bring to the table in our multiple identities as clinical psychologists has truly shifted over the years. There was a way that my multiple identities felt invisible in the scope of the work that I was doing, and it felt separate. And I feel like over the years, there's been a sense of the importance of who we are in our multiple identities as clinical psychologists, right? And that those aren't as separate as they have been. And I think that's something that's changed in all of my roles as a professor, as a supervisor, as a clinician, as a community psychologist, and as a researcher.
Yes, yes. Can we stop for a moment? I think
Sure, yeah.
Sorry. I have a question.
Yes.
This is so good that we're actually doing a trial.
I'm glad we're thinking of this as a practice run because that's helpful. Yeah.
Because as you're talking, I'm thinking of some other questions that come to my mind spontaneously, right? Like, for example, you mentioned you didn't have like a diversity. Oh, it's still recording. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay.
I think this conversation would be helpful to go back to as well.
Oh, okay, good. Because as you're saying, oh, I didn't have a diversity course when I was a graduate student, right? That's a really important change from, when that happened, when you were in training and now. So then my mind goes, oh, let me ask her a question about that, right? So then, how did you feel when you first started, without the training, especially being a psychologist or a clinician of color, when you first began, when you didn't have mentors and so on, right? So I wanted to ask some questions, and I don't know if that's good to do that, or we just stick to the script. So then you finish, then I go to the second question. What do you think?
I think those natural questions are helpful. I think we are lofty in thinking of how many of these questions that we'll get to in an hour. But maybe we'll.
But then there was another part of me said, wait a minute, these podcasts are meant for supervisors to use them to help them, like specific skills, right? Like, what do I do in this situation? What resource do I have in that situation? So then if I ask you for more of your personal reflection on what development has been like for you, I don't know if we're moving away from the purpose or not.
Yeah, that's a great question. When I think about the purpose, part of it is also to understand other folks' experiences and what each supervisor has done to move through them or has integrated pieces of that in their development, and how they've come to the stance that they have currently, right? So I think if you're wondering about it, maybe bringing it back to training, how do you think that's impacted you as somebody who trains students now? Or like bringing it back to that? Yeah, that's a thought.
Yeah. Okay, I'll do that. So if I have like a question that naturally lead to what we want to discuss, maybe I'll put a spin on it so that it's more training focused or supervision focused. The other thing I realized, even with just the first question, it's probably too long.
It's long, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you can probably spend 20 minutes answering all those questions just in question number 1.
So a lot more simple.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think having a scope of questions that gives us a sense of who the person we're interviewing is as a clinical supervisor, but also what they have done and what they would do. Like to the skills piece that you're talking about, what advice would you have for psychologists who are supervisors, or like things that are more practical and they leave with like specific tidbits?
Yeah. So we may have to revise the questions a bit. Yeah. But maybe we'll go to the second question then.
Sounds good.
Okay. So have you had the opportunity to do your own work regarding racism and identity? And if you have, how has that changed the way you work with your supervisees, for example, or students? And how do you manage your own reactions during the supervisory process?
Well, you know, as a Black woman, as a daughter of immigrants, I've had to confront racism and my own identity, right? Because my identity, at least when I started graduate school and as I've moved through our field, I didn't feel like my specific identities and worlds were represented in the work that was before me. And so, like I said earlier, it felt separate. Right. And so there was a way that I had to reconcile how I understood myself as an intercultural, multicultural being and the layers of that and what I was doing in clinical settings. There was also the inkling, and that's developed over time, that if I was having to reconcile these pieces and that the one-dimensional way that I was learning to do the work that was before me might not actually meet the needs of folks who look like me and have similar experiences. And so doing my self-work, right, around my multi-intercultural identity was also doing the parallel work of understanding and expanding what this could look like and perhaps ought to look like for clients who look like me. I think early on, and even now, there are these myths that Black folks don't attend therapy, immigrants don't attend therapy. And the reality is that that's just not true, right? And perhaps there are ways that the work that we're doing is not applicable or doesn't meet those specific needs. And are there ways that we as a field could expand? And so doing my own self-work allowed me to open up space to think about what it might be like for folks who have similar experiences to me. Having said that, I was then also sitting across from many students over the years as a supervisor and understanding this one another relationship that we're in and coming to understand the varied levels of power differentials. And so part of my self-work, if you will, I ended up writing a paper, an autoethnography, if you will, on racial microaggressions in the supervisory relationship, where I specifically examined my own experiences as a Black woman who was also in a position of supervisory power, working with students in different settings. And I examined different instances of racial microaggressions, what came up for me personally, but also situated them in the larger context. So say, for instance, as a Black woman, right, I hold a particular position in our society, and I'm supervising a young white man right, who holds also multiple identities. And there are ways that then some of the power differentials that are typically in the outer world are shifted in the room. And how do I then take responsibility for the power that I hold in teaching this person, while understanding that they hold certain powers in the larger world in terms of microaggressions, and taking responsibility for my role as a teacher, but also as a human. Right. And so part of my work around that was writing a paper where I explored that, but also situated in a larger conversation, where I was able to reflect on these pieces that happen, not as just personal instances, but as part of a larger conversation.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, because most of the time, students and supervisees, I think they don't necessarily look at or examine the role of power, privilege, and oppression. They're very busy focusing on their clients who might be different from them in terms of understanding their cultural background or cultural practices. So that's such an important point, and I really want to read your paper, of course. And so good. Well, the next question that I had for you was, in terms of doing this kind of work in your career, what are some obstacles, barriers? I'm sure on multiple levels, individual, institutional, cultural. What are some of these obstacles and barriers you have encountered as a supervisor, teacher, consultant, working with students and supervisees, in training them to become more culturally competent?
There are a couple of ways that I think about this. I think that I know that students come to us in the various settings and roles that I'm in, with differing levels of awareness, of self-awareness. And I think that part of the beauty and the challenge of being a supervisor and a teacher and somebody who's in training is being able to gauge where students are in terms of their self-awareness, have a sense of where they need to get, right? In order to truly be able to do this work in a way that sees the clients that they'll be seeing, right? And to help them to craft a plan to get there and to support them through that, right? Some of the obstacles that can get in the way of that process, right, is the building of relationships, right? Is being in larger systems that support that trajectory, right? Being in a system that supports having a diversity of students in the first place. And then sometimes there are inclusion criteria into the different programs that would exclude certain students who really could use that kind of support, but we exclude them on the front end. I'm getting mixed up here, through our admissions criteria, if you will.
Yeah.
And so I think some of the obstacles are rigid boundaries about who gets to come in, and then making sure that we have the resources to support and scaffold the students as we assess where they are and help them and come up with a plan that helps them to get where they are, right? But without the resources to truly support them, it can really leave them floundering. It could leave the, training folks, supervisors floundering as well. So making sure that we're properly resourced in supporting our students. And I think that the larger, if we think about the macro system, that in some ways we can be fighting against certain principles in the larger system that don't want to see folks as individuals or don't value mental health. And so I think it's also making sure that we're resourced in working through those larger obstacles, larger systems that don't value mental health and don't offer resources. So I guess across the board, the obstacles and barriers would be appropriate resources to get students into programs and to support them appropriately through the programs. Those are some of the obstacles and barriers on a number of different levels.
Yeah. And I definitely agree that that is an important or significant barrier and obstacle. Um, but then when we think about the solutions, or how do we overcome those barriers and obstacles, I think it's quite challenging because sometimes there just isn't enough resources for our supervisees and students, and oftentimes it's a systemic issue.
Mhm.
Um, one example I can think of is everywhere I have been, um, all the teachers or psychologists or supervisors of color, they're stretched so thin because they are mentoring so many students and clinicians in training and so on. They love doing it, including myself, but oftentimes we're overcommitted. And so I wonder if you had the same experience and how you sort of approach that issue. Many of the supervisors are experiencing the same thing, especially supervisors of color.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think first naming that there are disproportionate responsibilities placed on supervisor of color in particular. So that's one piece, naming it and trying to find a way of balancing, right, the load that everyone is carrying. Right. So within a system, that's something that the system can do. I think another big piece from a larger systemic level that I think has been really beautiful is to see the shift since I started my career in clinical psychology to now, of the role of mental health advocacy, right? And so client-led groups, right? Like, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, mental illness, I got that wrong. So mental health advocacy, right? And decreasing the stigma around seeking support around mental health has opened up so much in terms of understanding the need and then demanding resources, right? So I think that the mental health advocacy that has happened over time has really offered a seismic shift in how we talk about mental health, how we talk about wellness, right? And then that trickles down to systems where in the last year and a half, and we're talking about COVID-19 and the pandemic and the layer of, racialized trauma, all of this has highlighted the need for everyone, right, to really be able to have the kind of mental health and wellness support that they need. Corporations, educational systems, communities are really focusing on mental health and wellness. And I think that's all related to the advocacy of folks over the years, and it's culminating in a space where we've realized the resources and we're really rallying resources towards that. So I think that, to your question, that is something that has really shifted and I think needs to continue, because that will be part of the cycle of increasing resources across the board.
Well, that's really encouraging to hear, but it's work in progress.
It is, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Let's see. The other question that's important, I think, is that how have you been able to recognize and integrate the various social contexts and intersectionality issues when working with students and supervisees, especially those who may not be directly impacted by systemic racism and issues of equity and social justice? In general, what has been the most difficult challenge for you? And what is an example of a time where you were successful in helping your supervisee grow in their multicultural competence?
Yeah, that was a mouthful. I will start off by saying that systemic racism, in my view, impacts everyone. It disproportionately and negatively impacts people of color. But it impacts everyone, right? Particularly in the United States, thinking about working in this setting. I think racism is this strange piece that's woven into the fabric of our union, but also is what's tearing us apart. And the reality is that all of us are part of this union, right? And if systemic racism is tearing at that union, it's tearing at all of us. I will say that, of course, it does impact people of color more negatively than others, but I think there are ways that it impacts everyone. So I think first off is recognizing that everyone suffers from systemic racism, that it may seem like it benefits some individuals or groups of people, but that truly, if we're not able to thrive as a nation together, we're not truly thriving, even though individuals or groups of people might look like they're thriving.
Yes.
So that's one thing that I would say. And so I would say that equity and social justice isn't just for people of color. Equity and social justice is for everyone. It's for our entire society, right? And I think that we can sometimes buy into this zero-sum competitive, if I'm not winning, you're winning, as though we all can't be winning. I think that we can sometimes buy into that. And that may be why we're not as willing to fight for equity for all, or social justice for all, but that is a lie. And so I think naming that as a lie, naming that as an untruth, and then centering, right, the fact that everyone benefits from equity and social justice is critical. I think when I think about how to communicate that for and to my students, that identifying that as a salient and important issue can really be helpful. What's been the most difficult challenge for me? I will say this, that as a Black woman, it's this interesting dynamic that I feel both invisible and hypervisible, right? When it's convenient for certain systems. And it can be disorienting, right? Until I orient myself, right, through conversations like this or making sense of it. And so that has been one of the biggest challenges. And I think that as I move forward, early in my career, it was more of a challenge because there was more at stake in terms of the risk of speaking out. I think I'm at a place in my career now where, to be quite frank, the risk isn't as high.
Yes.
You know, and I think that that also means that I have to recognize, right, not the privilege, that's not the right word, but the responsibility that goes with having a voice that gets heard, right? In ways that other colleagues that look like me who are more junior won't get heard. And so that's a heady thing to have to hold, right? But it's also been very freeing and liberating. And then I think about what it means for my students, all of my students, not just my students of color, but what it means that I'm speaking out and using my voice in the direction of what's right for us all, right? So what's an example of a time when I was successful in helping my supervisee grow in multicultural competence? You know, it's interesting. I think about opening up spaces in the classroom.
Yes.
And I tend to come from a Socratic perspective where I ask a lot of questions and I push hard, right? I pushed really hard. And I remember being in a particular situation and I was with another faculty member and there was a student defending a particular case, if you will, presenting a particular case. And I know this student very well. And so I pushed and I pushed and I pushed. And it's funny, this student would joke that where they presented was under a light and she would say, oh, that's Dr. Langtiw's hot seat, right? But the reality is that I would push because I knew, right, what the student knew, what they could present, and I believed that they could rise to the occasion. And the other faculty members sort of jumped in with a response when I asked a question, and the student stood there for a moment. And I asked them to wait and said, give them some space and time. And the student did come with a very beautiful, initially stilted, hesitant answer, but then grew into their answer. And the look of pride on their face, knowing that they were able to move through a difficult process and tolerate it and move through was really beautiful. And I think that the times and spaces where I've seen students falter, but not fall, and really find their voice through that faltering and come out of the other side of that learning process feeling supported, but also feeling confident in their ability to move through something hard, you know, and the idea that they would leave whatever course, whatever supervision, knowing that they can do hard things, right? And digging deep and taking responsibility for power dynamics, digging deep and seeing a client and the complexities of a client, tolerating discomfort, tolerating silence. All of those are ways that open up space for the client to be seen, right? The client's humanity to be centered. And when I think about multicultural competence, at the beginning and the end of the day, that's what it is about, in my view, right? The ability to clear away all that gets in the way of me being able to see this other human being in front of me, and for them to truly be seen in the multiplicity of layers, in the intersectionalities of their identities. And it takes a lot of self-reflection and tolerating discomfort. And I've seen some really beautiful moments of that in my work. And those are some places that I just see students again and again and again continue to shine.
Yeah. Well, I can relate to your experience. I also taught a diversity-related competence course for many years before. I think one question, maybe a follow-up question I have for you is that I do see those moments where students really are able to see what is needed and able to kind of rise to the occasion and be able to really do the work that's needed. Over the years, though, I have found that for many of my students, at least, once the moment passes, the moment is very powerful, I agree. And it's a moment of enlightenment, and it's a very moving moment for actually the student and the supervisor and the teacher. But then the moment passes, and then I see that student kind of starts to revert back to what feels comfortable for them, especially for students or supervisees who are not impacted by social injustice or inequity day to day, you know. And that's why what you said earlier really resonated with me, that it impacts everyone. It doesn't just impact marginalized people, it impacts everybody. But many of our students, unfortunately, don't realize that. And it's almost like in and out the other year sometimes. I don't know if you had the same experience, and maybe you have a solution.
Yeah, what a conundrum.
It's very discouraging, you know, like you teach this person, 3 years later, you have another encounter, especially with social media. There's so many opportunities to see what they're doing, how they're doing it, and so on. And then I see that the student is doing something that is completely the opposite of
antithetical to what we've learned. That's a really great question. You know, I mean, I think about the fact that we're ever evolving, you know, and that we're never truly back at the beginning of a learning process, but that we're at another place in the spiral, right? And that the layers of learning just keep coming. And my hope is that whatever they learned earlier, right? Like if it really sinks in and we really allow that to, just that sink in, that will influence future learnings and future abilities to see and keep learning, and perhaps an interest. I think also understanding why, right? Can I tell a brief, well, maybe not so brief story? There's this soapbox that I have. So I teach qualitative research methods, and there are so many parallels to my clinical work and to my supervisory work. And I teach, and my students are always surprised at how adamant I am around validity and rigor in qualitative research. But I am a stickler for validity, reliability, rigor in all of research. And the reason why is that participants come and they fill out our measures, they sit across from us, and they allow us to interview them. But really, they're giving us like their insights, they're giving us that, and they're trusting, right, that we will do right by them and the ways that we interpret the data, make sense of the data, deliver the data, disseminate it. They're trusting us. And for me, reliability, validity, rigor is about trustworthiness. It's about doing the self-work as a researcher, as a clinician, as a supervisor, doing the self-work to clear myself out of the way so that the participant or client's voice is centered, right? And so when I think about clinical training and clinical supervision, my hope is that I'm not just teaching techniques and tools, but I'm teaching the importance of doing the self-work, right? That will allow the presence of the client. As similar to as a researcher, doing the self-work that will allow the participant's voice to be centered. And so I'm a little more hopeful while I'm teaching, because I'm not teaching or supervising to learn a technique, although I do teach techniques, right? Specific skills. So that does happen. But more I'm teaching, my hope is to ingrain how one should be thinking about how and who you are as a clinical psychologist, right? And that, I hope, transfers to different settings, right? And so that's why a lot of my focus is on that self-transformation, because that will stay. The difference between grounded theory and phenomenology might not stay, but who I am as a researcher, who I am as a clinician will. Hopefully.
I mean, connecting who you are as a person and who you are as a professional, I think that's so important, especially for psychologists to embody the values and beliefs of who you are. I think that is really important. Let's see if I can go on to the next question. We have been talking a lot about different ways of teaching, supervising, and so on. So how do you promote or teach culturally responsive interventions? And what seemed to have worked for you and your students and supervisees?
I do this exercise in my diversity course, and Dr. Ashley Malin, who also teaches the diversity courses, excellent supervisor and teacher, has transformed Pamela Hayes' addressing model into what we call the social identity profile. And really, it's examining multiple layers and levels of our own identities, right? And how power and privilege plays a role for us on those multiple layers. And so to go back to Dr. Camille Crenshaw's idea of intersectionality. And not only to do that, but to also do that in relation to our clients, right? Either having our clients fill them out, having their clients fill them out, or having a sense of that. And that step of understanding my multiple identities as they intersect with this other human being, this other family, this other community, this other couple, intersecting identities is the critical step in culturally responsive interventions, because it's in being able to see what's in the room and who this other entity is that we can actually use the techniques, the skills, what we've learned, and tailor them to the multiple identities that our clients bring to the table. So that self-reflection is the bedrock of being able to implement culturally responsive interventions. I mean, we can teach and we can have our students read and practice all of these, but if they don't identify where, when, and how to use them, then they're still not culturally responsive. Right? So I think understanding that I-thou relationship between them and their clients, what that is, and then how to use that in the service of assessment, and then, right, using some of the skills that they've read about in the research, or using adapting some of those appropriately. And I see my role as helping them to identify that piece, but then also how to think about what specific interventions they could adapt to use to work with their clients.
Yeah, the experiential component is really important in terms of self-growth and awareness.
Yeah,
it really is. Yeah, I'm curious, when you present that exercise to your students, for example, I'm assuming they're just beginning their training and they're just getting started, and maybe many of them have not really thought about their multiple identities and so on. How do they respond?
You know, it's interesting. So there's usually some surprise, right? And I find that the most surprise happens around areas where a student had not had to think about this area. And that's typically an area where they hold a master status or some privilege, right? And so it's a surprise to them to have to think about it and to think about what it must be like for a client to wonder about that identity about them, or to experience that identity. So I often find surprise and then some confusion about what to do with that then. And then that's part of the supervisory relationship. Like, these are the ways that your whiteness is coming up for you. These are the ways that your heterosexuality is coming up for you. These are the ways that your ability is coming up in this space, or could be coming up in the space for this client. Let's examine that. Let's explore that.
That's such a good beginning, right? Because surprise leads them to maybe curiosity and to be more open. Learning, more awareness.
But the other piece is also tolerating some of the discomfort, right? Because I think sometimes some students can feel guilty that they have the privilege that they do in different areas, and they can feel stuck or frozen. So helping them to get unstuck and unfrozen, and then be able to take action is another role that I see myself playing as a teacher and a supervisor.
Yes, that's so important, because sometimes guilt just makes them stuck and stops the learning process. There's yes, it's a powerful emotion for sure. Let's see. Another question is, how do your students or supervisees translate their awareness and knowledge to action when it comes to providing culturally adaptive interventions? Perhaps you can share some examples with us?
This will take a moment because I want to.
Yes, it's an important question.
So I mean, I think about it's interesting you asked earlier about doing that social identity profile at the beginning of their work. I actually, in recent years, have started doing that social identity profile with students who are further along. right? So yeah, we do it in the first year in the diversity class, but we're also doing it in your fourth year while you're taking advanced practicum seminar and you're in advanced practicum and revisiting it. I'm doing it with some of my interns, right, who are now in the field working and thinking in different ways and examining what they initially thought when they did the social identity profile and who they are today, not just as human beings and personally, but professionally. Like, how is the social identity profile impacting the clinical work on a day-to-day? So I think that's one piece that I use to continue to sit with that self-awareness and to help them to identify not just what might be an interaction with the client, but what has happened in their interactions with clients, right? And so I think about actually a group of my students who are interested in working in the area of neurodiversity, right, and neuropsychology. And one of the spaces that comes up is working with families where a child or a youth is experiencing and living with autism or living with autism. And I find that there are certain approaches to working with youth who experience autism that can bump up against the values that some of my students hold in terms of how to do this work. And so, say for instance, they're at a more behavioral setting, but they themselves, and that those are the interventions that are typically used, but they themselves tend to be more person-centered in the way that they do the work. And so that there's an incongruence, right? And so part of what I help my students to do is to identify the source of that incongruence and their ideas and assumptions about ability and what a person ought to be able to do and should be able to do, and how they're using interventions to help them move towards that, right? And so are the goals that they're helping their clients with commensurate with their values? And sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. And if they're not, then what can you do to have the work that you're doing with this client and the way that you're thinking about how and who they should be in the world, given our sort of frame for ability in the US, right? And across the world in many ways, how can you then move towards a space where you are coming from an authentic, congruent place in terms of your values and how you believe change occurs and how you believe others should be seen in working with somebody with a different ability status than you, right? And so that's a specific conversation that we continue to have. And then how do they adapt these specific interventions that they're using to meet the client where the client wants to be? Is an important piece, an example of that.
Yes, yeah. I love the idea of revisiting the same experiential exercise to examine what has changed or what has not. Maybe that's the more important, significant question. But I love that idea. Yeah. Cynthia, I'm wondering if you need a few minutes before your class starts.
I do.
Yeah. So far, I think it's going well.
I do too. Yeah. The questions simplified down, but I think the ones that ask for examples are important because that gives a sense of what to do.
Yeah.
So we can
some of the questions need to be simplified. I agree with you. Yeah.
I do like the specificity though. Like, what are you doing? What do you do? How do you do it?
Yeah. Just like when you talked about the social identity exercise, the multiplicity and so on, that's a great example, I think. And
we can hyperlink some of these things too to the podcast, hyperlink resources, all of those pieces that we include. Okay.
All right.
More to come. And I took some of the notes on what we talked about on the OneDrive sheet. If you want to put some of them there so that we have them in one place about what we want to do, and then we can keep talking.
Sounds good.
All right. And then I'll figure out how to download this recording.
Sounds good. Yeah, you'll get a message saying that it's converting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where to put it.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.